Hi, so I'm going to give a bit of a background on where Koinonia Farm and SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where they fit into the overall framework of the civil rights movement in the United States. And then I'm going to give a bit more detail on each of the chapters and what are the main themes and concepts that you should really grab from both of these chapters. So, as you probably already know, the civil rights movement in the United States didn't actually begin in the mid 20th century with, you know, uh, Rosa Parks deciding not to move her seat on a bus in Montgomery. That's only what's known as a precipitating agent, something which takes what has been on the background, what has been underground, has been quiet, and makes it much louder, much more prominent, and kind of takes it from sort of a low place to a very prominent place in society. But there's been a consistent witness in the Christian church to social justice since the beginning of the United States. This isn't something that is, again, new, but it has been a more of a minority movement, which has been running parallel to the overall pressure on the Christian church to maintain the status quo of first the system of enslaving African peoples, which began, as you know, in the early 1600s, and then moving on after the Civil War to the system of racial segregation, which has been present in the U.S. People have been advocating for the abolition of slavery since the very beginning of this system of chattel slavery, but it didn't develop into a unified movement until somewhere around the end of the 18th century, towards the beginning of the 19th century, so the late 1700s to the early 1800s, with the early abolitionist movement. Now, after the American Civil War ended the system of chattel slavery as legal in the United States in 1865, the United States government attempted to establish significant reforms in racial justice through the system of Reconstruction. However, these efforts were eventually stopped, and then every gain that was built was rolled back by a combination of both Southern intransigence and Northern apathy, among other causes. When the Supreme Court of the United States dropped the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling in 1896, where it declared that the concept of separate but equal was constitutional, that one could have effectively segregation in the United States as long as the facilities were, again, separate but equal. This provided a legal support for white people to create an entire system of segregation that became known as the Jim Crow system. Now, the Plessy versus Ferguson didn't just sort of make it legal to segregate. It also, by proclaiming it as legal, it actually put a significant damper on white, I guess, protest against the system, because it was, again, seen as legal, and thus it was acceptable. Now, that meant that white support for civil rights dipped, which meant that it placed the burden back where it had always been on the backs of black people trying to fight for their own rights. Now, from around 1896 to 1950, a number of different circumstances happened in the United States, and you start to see a slow buildup of a number of different forces which all come together in the mid-1950s, which lead to a greater amount of energy and support within the black community for another big push for civil rights after, of course, the failure of Reconstruction. due to numerous factors, but especially the centrality of the Christian church within black life and communities, and the foundational ethical and theological beliefs of Christianity about the equality of all people before God, coupled with the idea, this Christian idea of the universal love of God for all of humanity, the black church played a central role in shaping the rhetoric of the movement more broadly, as well as the early push for nonviolent direct action. Now, the beloved community is a concept which has held great prominence in the American civil rights movement, due, again, to its deep roots in the Christian church. Many of the early contributors to the 20th century movement for civil rights, as well as the 17th, 18th, and 19th century movements for abolition, were all actually deeply rooted in the Christian church. And deeply rooted in and emerging from these core Christian ideas, these Christian theological ideas of equality and of the universality of God's love. Now, the beloved community wasn't specifically just speaking about racial justice. It's a concept we're going to be returning to over the next several weeks, actually, kind of teasing out in a number of different ways. But this is an idea that is actually rooted in a biblical concept known as covenant, where the earliest framing of it is this idea that God is establishing a covenant with Adam, actually, a relationship where he says that I will support you, I will try to be present for you while you are experiencing this challenge of being kicked out of Eden. And then we see it again in the situation with Noah, where we have God making a commitment, a commitment of relationship with humanity, saying that I will never try to kill creation ever again. And then it sort of reaches its apogee in the Abrahamic covenant, where God makes an agreement with Abraham that Abraham should be in exclusive relationship with Yahweh and with God in the Hebrew understanding, that would also be coupled along with God promising that Abraham's descendants would be like the sand on the seashore, like basically innumerable. Okay, sort of promising Abraham that he and his line would survive throughout time. So covenant is this idea that God and humanity can be in relationship, and that God has a responsibility to uphold this relationship with humanity. They're both sort of co-creators of this, and that this community that is developed between God and humanity can be expressed in its most perfect form in a vision of harmony between God, humanity, and the creation. And then when it's sort of and this, you see this in a lot of different instances in Micah, in the book of Isaiah, this prophetic sort of framework of this political and social and ecological idea where everything is in harmony, and then when every aspect of creation is in harmony with the will of God, then you have something called the beloved community. Okay, so this idea then gets passed into the civil rights movement through the black church, through the prominence of the black church in the early civil rights movement, and framing this idea of racial integration as an aspect, an element of the beloved community, where justice, peace, equality, and truth were all balanced, perfectly meeting the divine will for the creation. Now, Marsh's book covers many of the main religious groups and communities that are active in the civil rights movement, with a special focus on communities and organizations that sought to bring about the beloved community. chapters 2 and 3 present two different visions of the role of communities in social change and the way that they try to, I guess, embody this concept of beloved community. When we get to chapter 6 and 7, we look at Marsh sort of playing this idea out through a examination of how the Voice of Calvary movement looked at both the Koinonia Farm and SNCC and some other elements of the movement, and decided to kind of, in some way, bring all of their lessons together and combine it in such a way that it sort of establishes a vision of, moving forward that's pretty formative and important for any of the sort of movements, any of the communities that strive to be reconciliation communities moving forward, and taking these ideas of the early civil rights movement and sort of embodying them. And you can see that in chapter 6, where we talk about generally the Voice of Calvary community, and in chapter 7, where we look at people influenced by Voice of Calvary who are then implementing that in real real time. Now the video is going to cover basically most of Marsh's books, so this is going to be a bit of a longer video. But I do want to kind of, again, place the entire framework of what we're talking about and why we're talking about it, specifically in these, these communities that are in trying to embody these ideas and these ideals. So first, chapter 2, the Koinonia Farm. Now, koinonia is just a Greek word meaning fellowship, the perfect community of sharing and common care. Thus, also, koinonia would also be seen as the beloved community or a covenant community. The Koinonia Farm is built around the ideas of a guy named Clarence Jordan. Now, before I get to Clarence Jordan's idea, I first want to sort of frame the idea that Koinonia Farm kind of really roots itself in, and it's this idea of faith-based socialism. And chapter 2 goes into some great depth about what that looks like, but I want to emphasize that Jordan is presenting a vision of socialism that is not rooted in sort of the ideas of Marx, Lenin, or Mao. This is instead actually doesn't even really take that kind of vision of socialism into account, and it's rooted entirely in this, this vision, this overarching Judeo-Christian vision of the beloved community. So it's also been termed a Christian socialism. It's heavily influenced by visions of common living and communal interdependence, where every person in the community is dependent upon every other person. So it's like this weaving of communal ties. We're going to see this idea of interdependence and communal ties emerge again when we look at the work of Desmond Tutu and his Ubuntu idea. This idea of interdependence and interdependence theology is deeply informative and important in a lot of Christian social witness and a lot of movements for peacemaking and specifically a specific form of peacemaking known as reconciliation. So this Christian socialism, you can see it, presented in different areas of Christian scripture, specifically the book of Acts, which is describing in its earliest chapters, Acts 2 and 3, describing the socialism of the early Christian community as present in the concept of the common purse. And, something where everyone in a community, puts all their money together, pools their money for the purpose of, people can then extract money to, if they need to get funds and to buy things or, whatever, to do what they need to do to help the community run. But this common purse idea is going to be central to koinonia. It's also going to prove to be divisive and controversial in the life of the community. Now, chapter 2 spends a great deal of time exploring how all of these ideas influenced Clarence Jordan in his early life and led him to his fateful decision to commit to developing an agrarian expression of the beloved community, which is basically farming, with explicit ties to a very specific place. This is a farm community in a very specific area of southwest Georgia, which was rooted in a very specific ecological version of reconciliation. Ecological meaning that it is connected to a vision of the ecology or the creation. So this is an idea that you are enacting reconciliation literally by farming. You are connecting to the earth, and by farming together in an integrated, a racially integrated community, you are bringing integration and interdependence, both in the actual land itself, and then the land presenting that back to the community through flourishing and what have you. But it's also contextual in that it's rooted in a very specific place. Koinonia Farm is not trying to be like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was the group that King was running, Martin Luther King, where it's trying to work on a racial reconciliation everywhere. Instead, Koinonia Farm is like, we're going to be right here, in our little community near Americus, Georgia. And this vision of reconciliation is rooted in a Christian need to heal both the racial divisions between humans and the fact that the land itself was sick and broken. Now, it's a broader idea, like the South is broken, so the land of the South needs to be healed because it is sort of, broken because of, segregation and Jim Crow racism and all of this stuff. But also, he literally bought land that needed to be healed. And chapter 2 goes into some detail on that. So it's sort of a symbolic act that as he heals the land, he might also heal the land, the larger concept of land in the South. Now, the chapter explores the theological, economic, and political background, everything going on around that, and the ways that Jordan and the Koinonia Farm struggled to fight the racist structures upon which the way of life of southwestern Georgia was founded. It explores their triumphs, as well as their multiple challenges, including at least 2 times when the farm was facing extinction. The farm's vision of a socialist egalitarian Christianity, especially the radical idea that racial justice was inherent to Christian teachings, ran directly counter to the dominant Christianity present not only within the South, but also the entire country. As such, its very existence was a fundamental threat to Southern life. And the farm, this specific place, not just the fact that it was, specific people doing specific, reconciliation work in this area, but also the very idea that there could be a Christian community, a community that expressed itself inherently as Christian, doing reconciliation work through this very Southern vision of farming, instead of trying to push back against the very, root of Southern segregation, which is that it is unnatural. And thus, if it's unnatural, it is inherently going to not succeed for blacks and whites to work together. If they can have a community that's successful economically and that's successful socially and that it doesn't fall apart as a community, then they're actually showing that this whole idea that Southern segregation is built upon, that blacks and whites cannot naturally work together, that blacks are inherently inferior, that they're going to bring down the community, they're going to destroy it, yada yada. So if it succeeds in that it doesn't fall apart, then the South has to wrestle with that, and it's hitting directly at this core concept to Southern identity and meaning. Now, as a result, people around then see that and feel that, and that's what pushes all of these years of ostracism, the death threats and the shootings, and even boycotts from the surrounding community. They wanted to destroy the community and ensure that it didn't succeed for various reasons. Now, Koinonia Farm insisted on not only being a community which embodied Christian teachings within its own borders, which might have been tolerated by a wider society, possibly, again, if they can sort of say, you are in your tucked off little corner over here, separate from society, we're just going to ignore that you exist, and we can maybe accept that. But because it also sought to evangelize others in this vision of the gospel as lived at koinonia, that's what brought all the change and all the challenge. The second aspect was the point of greatest conflict, that they tried to open up their work to the wider world. Jordan was uncompromising about his vision, which eventually led to a falling out between King and Jordan. While King was just as radical in thought as Jordan, King was seeking to expand the coalition of those involved in the civil rights movement, and thus was open to shifting his tactics and language in order to not make people who might be allies be, inherently sort of pushed away. Jordan, however, didn't see a reason to compromise anything for anyone. Now, chapter 3, continuing on this idea, what we're going to be talking about in this lecture mainly is looking at these three different, I guess, visions of the beloved community. And the fourth chapter is sort of looking at how this has sort of manifested itself in the 2000s generally, okay? Because the book was written in 2005. It's a little old, but its ideas are still really, really amazing. Okay, so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, talked about in Chapter 3, developed from the coalition of people engaged in the sit-ins of the early 1960s, where black activists sought to force segregated, whites-only lunch counters in the South to become integrated by sitting in the restaurants. Literally, sitting there, again, being a witness by being present in a chair in a space that probably above the counter has a sign that says whites only, by sitting in that chair and by forcing them to deal with them, forcing the restaurant to deal with them, then they are, as a symbolic act, proving that segregation can be pushed back and can be broken, okay? And when you don't move, you demonstrate that you're not respecting the Jim Crow segregation system. It is pretty impossible to exaggerate the absolute hold that Jim Crow had over life in the South. Literally everything about life in the South depended upon this system of racial segregation, this whole structural, oppressive system, and was influenced by it. As a result, the civil rights movement, often had to wrestle with balancing those who were radical and unyielding in their demands of perfect adherence to a specific set of ideals, whether those by religious, as in koinonia, or political, as in the rise of black nationalism, which arose in the mid-60s and, as the chapter explains, eventually consumed SNCC and led to its dissolution. Okay, so they're trying to balance this sort of perfect adherence to ideals, okay, on one end, while at the same time working, trying to pursue legal and political reforms in a more, I wouldn't say it wasn't moderate, but it was more of a pragmatic approach, more of an acknowledgement of, the fact that ideals might need to shift or be flexible in order to achieve the greater goal of legal and society change. And that sort of pragmatic approach was represented by the coalition of King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, so SNCC is trying to sort of hit at this core fundamental idea that's inherent in Southern society, that Southern society is built upon, Jim Crow, while balancing the ideals of people within SNCC and who are coming into SNCC as it sort of continues its work, specifically black nationalism, along with this other whole part of the movement, which is trying to be much more pragmatic and, according to the idealists, compromising. Now, the history of SNCC can be broadly summed up as a movement from the radical Christianity of its earliest workers, many of which were inspired by Koinonia Farm and its vision of radical Christian social witness, rooted in service to the poor and oppressed, very specific places. This is a very contextualized vision of the work. So these earliest members of SNCC were really influenced by this contextual civil rights. But as SNCC moves on, it eventually sort of becomes consumed by a radical black nationalism, which it was exhausted by a decade of nonviolence as the only accepted expression of work in the movement, and also a sense of having their patience stripped away by having to put up with the slow moving pragmatic approach of SCLC. And SNCC sort of, that's kind of what you can see sort of playing out, and the chapter really talks about this well, that at core it is a movement that is trying to balance all of this stuff at the same time as actually just doing work and living amongst actual people in actual communities. Now the chapter explores the ways that SNCC tries to work on this vision, and specifically through an in-depth exploration of the work and ideas of individual people, which is the thread of the whole this whole class, is what does justice seeking and peacemaking look like, individual communities and individual people. Looking at specifically Fannie Lou Hamer, John Lewis, and Bob Moses, and the efforts of white members, including Bob Zellner, Jane Stembridge, and others. Now, a key element of the work of SNCC, as I've kind of just pounded on over and over again, was this incarnational ethic, where just as Jesus's body was the incarnation, meaning literally the embodiment of God, in that Jesus, in this Christian idea, is literally both God and human in this one body, SNCC members were supposed to express the ideals of SNCC in every aspect of their life. So therefore they were literally, as they walked around the earth, by embodying the ideals of SNCC, they would act as if they were representing SNCC in every single thing they did. Now, this embodiment was quite literal. They were supposed to live within the communities they were serving and adapt themselves to the rhythms and concerns of those they were serving. This vision of incarnational organizing was particularly emphasized by Bob Moses. The chapter spends a great deal of time developing all the different aspects of Moses' approach to the work, along with establishing the fault lines built into that work, which would eventually lead both Moses and many of the other black SNCC members to a sense of disillusionment, not only with the work of SNCC itself, but towards white people in general. One of the challenges which emerged was this aforementioned balance between the religious and political aspects of the work. Now, while SNCC was built upon a decidedly Christian vision of social justice and socialism, again, this beloved community idea, many of the workers drawn to this work did not share those very specific faith concerns. These discontinuities would eventually grow to be so significant that they would lead folks on both the religious and political sides of SNCC to give up, basically. Now, the bulk of the chapter are devoted to charting these developments, and it follows Marsh's overall framework of choosing to illustrate broader trends through the work and beliefs of specific individuals. And that's why we're really reading this book as the first book we're looking at in this class. The main takeaways of the chapter aren't the specific events and even the specific people, and this is a general way to imagine and wrestle with Marsh. It's not about the specifics, it's about the concepts, and it's about the way that these concepts play out in the lives of specific people. It's important to note that these trends impacted the civil rights movement more broadly. Again, this disillusionment, this rise in black nationalism, this impatience with nonviolence, this pushback against the the pragmatic, compromising element of SCLC, and it would sort of set the tone for the way the movement would adapt over time. And these are adaptations we see in chapter 6 and 7. Now, chapter 6 tells the story of John Perkins and his transformation first into a Christian, and from there into a civil rights advocate. The two chapters, 6 and 7, examine the same themes of the book from the perspective of what could be termed a hybrid, as I said at the beginning, of the Koinonia Farm model of rooted social action on one end and SNCC's incarnational activism on another. The Voice of Calvary was both a church ministry rooted in a very specific context, which also sought to bring both white and black people together into a community built upon the rhythms of daily life, and sought to inspire others from outside the community to not only live and work in the community, but to also see the Voice of Calvary as a model for doing racial justice ministry elsewhere. So Perkins eventually really tries to bring in all these strands together into this one sort of framework that he then says, sort of brings people intentionally to his community to teach them about this model and then bring it forward. Now, as we'll see in chapter 7, this model is incredibly compelling, especially for evangelical Christians with a heart for radical social ministry. We'll get to that in just a second. Now, the three big themes of these two chapters are really important things you really got to key in on. For one, you cannot forget that Christianity is incredibly internally diverse. Not only in theology, as the chapter really explains, as it covers Perkins' move from this very fundamentalist, sort of millennialist, strain of Christianity through to a much more, one could say, social justice, incarnational ministry, almost, a Christian socialist vision of Christianity, emphasizing a more universalist vision of God's love. So even just in John Perkins, we really see this lesson of this incredible diversity of Christianity. But that's something that you really have to remember as we're going forward in the class, is that there is no one way to be a Christian. There's also no one way to be a Christian and approach the question of racial justice. That's why it's really important to read that theme and see that theme in chapter 6, specifically even just in the person of John Perkins. He sort of represents that diversity, that idea of change and multiplicity of voices that's present within Christianity. So he starts off in this millennialist and fundamental strain, where they rejected the world, this sort of idea of world rejection theology is actually not just appealing for people who are in power, but it also has some appeal for people who are oppressed, because it says at some level, don't worry about how crappy things are now. There will be a time when things will be better. There will be a time when you are able to, be free and praise God, and that justice will come, and that you will be free to worship and connect with God. It is incredibly powerful for a variety of communities. Now, as Perkins moves towards the radical, and radical in its actual meaning, as in connected to the idea of radix, which is a Latin term or Latin word, literally meaning root. So radical is, literally going to the root of something, going to the very foundations of something. So as Perkins moves away from this sort of millennialist vision towards this radical Christianity, which is again rooted in a representation of Christianity, which is coming from Jesus's actual words, Jesus' actual actions, where you're centering the poor and oppressed, caring for them, caring for their actual living conditions in today, their current context, their current situation, trying to bring about relief and release from that current context. This is a significant thread in Christianity as well, where you'll see this emphasis on being present in the moment, seeking liberation for those who are currently dealing with oppression, and trying to achieve a sense of relief and justice in the moment, in the now. Okay, that is. You're going to see it in the liberation theology, as I said. You're going to see it in the intentional community movements in chapter 7, in urban settings. You're going to see it in the theology of a great number of the Christian left, as you can see it today. Try to find anyone talking about the Christian left, and you're going to find this emphasis on, God's. It's called in some senses the preferential option for the poor, that God has a special care and a special concern for the oppressed, and sort of puts them first. So these are sort of two strands that you see in Christianity that you see in these chapters. You also, as I said before, there's a sheer diversity of what social justice looks like in Christianity. Perkins still held what would now be considered, and what may have even been considered back then, a conservative approach to some aspects of morality, and his emphasis on the centrality and infallibility of the Bible, and that the Bible is the Word of God. It is as it is true. It is what God desires to have in our, it is literally the words that are in the Bible are true, and as a result, they must impact us, and we must take them on directly as they're written. That's a more conservative vision of the Bible, and you can see that in sort of how he frames his vision of morality. And there's a great number of Christians who are social justice focused that you see in chapter 7, that are also, you're going to find, conservative in other issues. Questions of sexual morality, questions of marriage, questions of abortion, and even questions of how poverty should be approached. Okay? Now, this sort of creates some interesting overlaps in that Perkins might agree with some doctrines of the millennialist and fundamentalist strains of the Christian right. He never got rid of some of those ideas, but he would also agree with the overwhelmingly strong social justice focus of what would be seen as the Christian left. So he rejects the teachings of some, he rejects the teachings of both the left and the right, and he tries to create this interesting hybrid synthesis. So again, this main point, it is vital to never accept any one definition of what a Christian is or is not, and therefore what a Christian politics or a Christian approach to politics would actually look like. A second main theme of these chapters 6 and 7 is that the civil rights movement didn't end with the implosion of SNCC, the death of MLK in 1968, and the rise of the peace movement again around 1968 against the war in Vietnam. Instead, it adapted. The civil rights movement learned from the lessons of these other previous programs, and tried to create new ways of addressing the context of the seemingly intractability of uh, segregation, as an economic and structural issue, but also a racism inherent within people's minds. All right. Um, the movement sort of shows itself to be very creative in how it tries to continue the movement, continue the work of the movement, continue these fundamental ideas of the movement, moving forward as contexts change. And Christian social witness has generally moved towards this sort of incarnational, sort of communal focus that you can find in Voice of Calvary and the groups that are influenced by Voice of Calvary, as you see in chapter 7. It describes them, particularly with this insistence on centering the concerns and voices of communities directly impacted by oppressive structures and systems, and on an incarnational, embodied approach to the work. And these are summed up by Perkins' 3 R's, which chapter 6 goes into some detail, and then chapter 7 sort of shows how this is demonstrated in modern movements that have been impacted by or influenced by Voice of Calvary's work. And they are relocation, reconciliation, and redistribution. So starting off, the relocation, it is literally living amongst the poor and oppressed. It is actually being in that community, being aware of their concerns. The argument is being made that you cannot be aware of the concerns of those who wrestle with these oppressive structures and systems unless you yourself are walking right alongside people. And you know them, you are in relationship with them, you see what they're encountering, and then you can fully understand. The redistribution is where we see that socialism kind of bringing itself back around. Okay, but again, not a Marxist socialism, not a Chinese Maoist socialism, specifically a Christian socialism, which is rooted in this idea of redistributing. We are redistributing the wealth and the resources of the world for the good of everyone. Now, this idea, this redistribution, is based upon the sense that God is the creator of the entire universe. As God has created everything, nothing that you have is inherently yours. This sort of Christian idea that sort of runs through this, sort of teaches this idea that everything you have is a gift. It is nothing that you can ever claim. It is nothing that you can ever sort of stating as owning or having control over. So therefore, if you have wealth, you have it for the purpose of doing something with it. It's not a hoarding. It's not I'm going to be competitive, see how many billions I rack up. It is only yours for the purpose of then giving back to the community. It is finding a way to, build the community. And it is, again, both sort of working at the structural level, but also literally taking money and giving it to others directly. Okay? Taking resources and giving it to others. Giving up power and giving that power to others. Redistribution is not simply economic. Redistribution is everything. All of what we have, all of who we are supposed to give to others for the improvement of the world. This is what Perkins is preaching. And it's pretty radically huge, frankly. It's an idea that many Christian communities have stated that they agree with, but Perkins would sort of push back and respond saying, is your stated intent actually present in the actual work that you do? And then there's a reconciliation, which we're going to be talking about in much greater detail in the next few weeks as we talk about Tutu and Ubuntu theology. But this idea of reconciliation we can see is sort of fundamentally connected to again, I love etymology. I love sort of the discussion of words. This idea of reconciliare, where we are bringing back together in relationship. Christian reconciliation, the idea of Christian reconciliation is has a number of components, but one of the main ones is that through the person of Jesus Christ, theologically, as Jesus is both human and divine, Jesus brings together into relationship the God and humans. Now, how that works, there are so many ways. I'm not going to get into the details, but basically through this person, you see that. But then through him being human, the fact that God is human, therefore all humans are then inherently already in a relationship with each other because they are made as a part of God's creation. So Christian reconciliation fundamentally teaches that humans are already in relationships. So the idea of reconciliate, sort of, and come back into relationship, many of the ways that people have critiqued that idea is saying that, well, if we weren't in relationship in the first place, then how can we come back into relationship? Christian reconciliation is saying that, ontologically, meaning at the nature of being, ontos meaning the concept of being, what it is to exist. At our very core, we are people who are intended to be in relationship, that we are created in relationship with each other, and that it is the world, it is structures of oppression, and it is sin which breaks up and separates us from relationship with each other. Now, I'm spending so much time focusing on the question of theology and on the religious beliefs of these communities because you cannot understand why they do the work they do and the work they specifically do, like how they approach the work. You cannot understand it without understanding their theological convictions. You cannot understand Desmond Tutu and the whole way that he frames, because he kind of takes over the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa that tries to rehabilitate South African society with, after the dismantling of the apartheid, which apartheid is just an Afrikaans word. Afrikaans is just sort of Dutch, but in South Africa. Afrikaans word, which effectively means apartness or separateness or segregation. Okay, apartheid is segregation. So Tutu kind of takes control of the nationwide effort to rehabilitate itself, to heal itself after the end of apartheid. So to understand how Tutu does this political work, you must understand what Tutu thinks theologically, because this is going to inherently impact how he frames the work. So when Perkins talks about these three R's as being sort of interwoven and foundational, and if you think about all these other movements that have been impacted, all these other, Christian peacemaking communities that have been impacted by Perkins, you have to understand that reconciliation is fundamentally a concept rooted in the human person and how people view how Perkins understands the human person as inherently in community with other persons. So thus, racism as an idea, like the very idea of being in separate racial categories, Perkins is going to, sort of dismiss out of hand, and he's going to see he's going to push back against black nationalism, and he's going to say that it is impossible to be in real relationship with anyone if one closes off relationship with anyone else. You cannot achieve anything as, just the black race, is what Perkins is going to say. We must be in relationship with, white people who are seeking to, bring about the same concept, the same existence of reconciled, beloved community. Now, we're going to be going into Tutu in the next few weeks, and this is going to come up, in a huge way as we look at those chapters.